They say family is forever, but mine only stayed long enough to steal $6.7 million. My name is Mara Ellison, 24 years old, born and raised in Milwaukee. I've always been the quiet one, steady, organized, the kind of woman who color codes tax folders and believes people mean what they say. That belief was the first thing they took from me. 2 weeks ago, I was standing in my parents' dining room, the same place where we used to blow out birthday candles and fold holiday napkins into little triangles. The oak table smelled faintly of lemon polish and deceit. My sister Elise slid a stack of papers toward me. "Just sign here," she said, cheerful like a clerk processing a return. "It'll simplify things. Dad's accountant says it's better for taxes if we consolidate everything under one family trust." My father nodded without meeting my eyes. My mother added, "It's still yours, honey. We're just protecting it." I should have stopped there, asked for a lawyer, but I wanted to believe them. 20 years of building Ellison contracting long nights, cold sites, payrolls that nearly broke me, and I still wanted to believe. I signed every page. 3 days later, the bank called to verify the ownership change. My name was gone from every account. My business, my house on East Kane Place, even my retirement fund transferred cleanly into a trust controlled by my parents and Elise. When I drove over to demand answers, Elise stood in the doorway in my favorite blazer, smiling like she'd won a prize. "Sue us," she said, her voice sugar-sweet. "You can't even afford it." I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I picked up my old duffel bag from the porch, the one I used to take on work trips, and walked to my rusted Subaru parked at the curb. The night air smelled like cold metal and lilacs. That's how I left everything behind and how Chapter 2 of my life began. In silence. The next morning, I walked into the Milwaukee Legal Aid Center clutching a folder that used to feel like armor contracts, receipts, the business charter with my name printed across the top. It had always made me proud. Now it felt like a relic. The volunteer who took my case was a young woman named Dana, sharp-eyed and kind in the careful way people are when they know they can't fix much. She leafed through the documents, her brow tightening as she read. "These signatures," she said finally, "they're all valid. You consented to transfer assets to a family-managed trust. I didn't consent to theft." I said. Dana's expression softened, but her words didn't. "Legally." "You did. Unless you can prove coercion, the court will see this as voluntary." Voluntary. The words scraped at me. I'd spent my life doing everything voluntarily, working weekends, helping my parents pay their mortgage, giving Elise her first loan. Apparently, that was the problem. I thanked Dana, took my folder, and walked out into the brittle Wisconsin wind. The city looked at the same gray buildings, coffee steam rising from vents, but everything felt hollow. That afternoon, I drove to the warehouse one last time. The sign that used to read Ellison Contracting now said Ellison Group, in sleeker lettering, my name quietly amputated. Elise's car was in my old spot. Through the office window, I saw my father at the reception desk, pretending to read the paper. My mother arranged a vase of fake lilies. When she saw me, she smiled with that uneasy warmth people use at funerals. "It's for everyone's good," she murmured through the glass, her lips barely moving. I nodded, because words had become useless currency. Inside me, something went still, a silence colder than the air outside. My name was gone from the doors, the trucks, the payrolls, the future. I stood there until the wind numbed my hands, then turned back to the car, clutching the folder that proved everything and meant nothing. The basement smelled faintly of old onions and wet plaster. The landlord had warned me the restaurant upstairs liked to test recipes late, which turned out to mean I'd fall asleep to the sound of boiling grease and the rattle of pipes. Rent was $700 a month cheap by Milwaukee standards, and even that felt like a gamble. The walls were painted a dull beige, streaked from leaks that no one had bothered to fix. I set up a cot, a folding table, and one lamp from my old office. When I switched it on, the light made everything look thinner, like a photograph fading from the edges. Most nights I didn't sleep. I'd lie there listening to the muffled laughter from the bar above, thinking about how quickly a life could vanish. A month ago I had employees, clients, a calendar full of meetings. Now my days were measured by the hours between microwaving soup and checking my phone for messages that never came. I kept a small shoebox under the cot. Things I couldn't throw away: a photo of me at 9 years old in a red winter coat. My grandfather, Harold Ellison, standing beside me in his factory uniform, both of us covered in sawdust and pride. Beneath that lay my childhood passbook from Midwestern Trust Co., the bank that no longer existed, its navy blue logo stamped 1960. One night, I opened the box again just to feel something familiar. The passbook slipped from my hands, scattering a few yellowed receipts. That's when I saw it: a small envelope, sealed with brittle tape, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable, my grandfather's. For Mara's future, open only when you've lost everything. I sat there on the cold floor, the envelope trembling between my fingers. For a long time, I didn't open it. Maybe I was afraid it would be empty, like everything else left behind. Or maybe I was afraid it wouldn't be, and I'd have to believe again in something I'd already buried. 2 days after finding the envelope, I woke before dawn and decided I couldn't keep wondering what was inside. The air in the basement was damp and heavy, the kind that clings to your skin. I slipped the passbook and envelope into my bag and drove across town to the Chase branch on Kinnickinnick Avenue, the one built over what used to be Midwestern Trust. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and coffee. I stood in line behind a man cashing his paycheck, my fingers tracing the embossed lettering on the old booklet: Midwestern Trust Co., established 1904. The paper felt soft, almost fabric-like, from decades of handling. When it was my turn, the teller looked up with polite confusion. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her name tag reading Clara. "Good morning," I said, sliding the passbook across the counter. "I'd like to see if this account still exists." Clara blinked at the booklet, smiled uncertainly, and began typing. "From 1960, she asked, half laughing. I nodded. "It belonged to my grandfather. I'm just checking." Her fingers froze. The color drained from her face. She cleared her throat and typed again, slower this time. "Could you wait one moment, ma'am?" She left her station and whispered to a man in a dark gray suit near the offices. He followed her back, his expression unreadable. "I'm Mr. Laskin, branch manager," he said, extending a hand. His grip was dry and steady, but his eyes darted to the passbook like it was something radioactive. "Would you mind stepping into my office?" My stomach tightened as I followed him through the glass door. He sat, turned his monitor toward himself, and scrolled for a long time, lips moving silently. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. The sound of someone trying to process numbers that shouldn't exist. "Ms. Ellison," he said quietly. "This account hasn't been touched since it was opened in 1960. It's been compounding annually at 7.5%. It was a long-term product, one of those legacy accounts from the old bank locked until the owner turned 45. He paused, checking my ID again. "That would be in 2 weeks. He turned the screen toward me. "You might want to sit down. Ms. Ellison." I did. The room seemed to tilt as a line of digits filled the monitor numbers so large they barely looked real. I pressed my palms together, afraid to breathe, afraid the moment might vanish if I moved too fast. The drive back to Bayview felt unreal, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and winter light. My hands were still trembling when I parked outside the building. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the passbook in my lap, afraid that if I looked again, the numbers would disappear. Down in the basement, the air was cold enough to fog my breath. I turned on the lamp, its yellow light pooling over the small table. The envelope had waited all these years, the tape brittle, the corners soft from time. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting tilted slightly to the right, familiar and careful, the same script that used to label my lunch bag in first grade. "Money is never power. Patience is, What's hidden cannot be stolen. Use this only when the world stops believing in you. Beneath the letter was a thin piece of paper, faded but legible. A purchase slip dated April 1965, 5 shares of Berkshire Hathaway, $19 each. My grandfather's name was signed at the bottom in blue ink. For a long moment, I just stared. Then, unable to stop myself, I opened my laptop and typed current value Berkshire Hathaway stock. The number that appeared made me cover my mouth. I refreshed the page twice, as if a glitch could make it smaller. But it didn't. The screen glowed with a fortune I couldn't comprehend. I sank into the chair. The letter still open beside me. My grandfather, who had worked 40 years at the Chrysler plant, who wore patched coats and packed lunches in the same tin box he had somehow seen further than any of us. Tears came slowly, without sound. They weren't from greed or relief, but from the shock of being loved by someone who'd been gone for 3 decades and realizing that love had been working quietly, earning interest the whole time. The following Monday, I met Lillian Cortez in a quiet office above a bakery downtown. The scent of bread drifted through the vents, softening the sharpness of the conversation we were about to have. Lillian was in her 50s, small-framed with eyes that missed nothing. She'd been recommended by the branch manager, Mr. Laskin, who'd spoken her name in a tone somewhere between respect and warning. She read through the copies of my old contracts and bank records, tapping a pen against the margin. They were smart, she said finally. Paperwork's clean. But fraud always leaves fingerprints. What kind, I asked. The kind made by people who think they're untouchable. She closed the folder and met my eyes. You don't win by shouting, Ms. Ellison. You win by timing. That line stayed with me. Under her guidance, I opened new accounts, quiet ones, registered under my initials. She introduced me to a forensic accountant named Brett Nolan, a man with the patience of an archaeologist. His job was to find what Elise and my parents thought they'd buried. Each week he sent brief updates, nothing dramatic, just lines of data and small confirmations that pieces were beginning to fit. I learned to move carefully. I paid off my last debts, cleaned my credit, and let the days pass without noise. There was an odd comfort in invisibility. My phone stayed silent except for notifications I didn't open. Elise, meanwhile, lived loudly. Photos appeared online, her new SUV, a weekend in Door County, champagne at the golf club. Every post tagged Weiner family business success. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I simply saved the screenshots in a private folder titled Proof. At night, I reread my grandfather's letter. The ink had faded, but the words still felt alive. Patience wasn't passive. I realized it was strategy disguised as surrender, and for the first time since losing everything, I felt the slow, steady pulse of something stronger than anger control. Outside my window, the snow was beginning to fall. It covered the streets, quiet and deliberate, erasing footprints one flake at a time. By late February, the investigation had become a rhythm morning coffee, quiet meetings, documents sliding across polished tables. Lillian worked like a surgeon, steady hands, no wasted words. Every few days, she called with a calm update that sounded almost casual, but each one carried the weight of years being quietly corrected. Brett, the forensic accountant, traced transfers Elise thought she had erased loan applications bearing my digital signature, accounts funneled through shell companies, and my parents' names listed as witnesses. The more he uncovered, the more I understood how complete their betrayal had been. Elise hadn't just stolen money, she had turned my trust into a tool. Lillian spread the findings across her desk one afternoon, paper edges neatly aligned. "This is more than a family dispute," she said. "It's a pattern fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. We'll file a civil suit for restitution and let the IRS handle the rest." I nodded, my throat tight. She waited, perhaps expecting celebration, but there was nothing to celebrate. The damage had already been done. All I could feel was a slow, exhausted kind of relief, the kind that comes from finally stopping a wound from bleeding. That night, I went home and made tea in my dented kettle, steam rising in thin ribbons. I opened my grandfather's old chessboard from the shoebox, the one we used to play on Sunday afternoons. I remembered his voice, calm and certain, as he moved his rook with surgical precision. Never move fast unless you're trapping a queen. I ran my fingers over the board, tracing invisible moves across its squares. Elise had always thought speed meant power quicker deals, louder wins, faster cars, but speed only works when you don't see what's waiting 3 steps ahead. The case file was nearly ready. All that remained was time, and time, at last, was on my side. The courthouse on Jefferson Street smelled faintly of dust and winter coats, that particular mix of paper and nerves. Lillian walked beside me, her briefcase balanced easily in one hand, as if we were heading to a meeting instead of a reckoning. I'd dressed simply dark sweater, clean hair, no jewelry. It felt wrong to look victorious. Elise arrived late, her heels striking the marble floor like a drumbeat. She wore a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my old Subaru, and her lipstick was the exact shade of defiance. My parents trailed behind her, quieter, faces pulled tight with worry. My mother gave a small wave I pretended not to see. When the hearing began, the courtroom settled into the hum of machines and whispered pages. Lillian laid out the evidence piece by piece, forged emails, doctored contracts, my digital signature copied onto loan documents. Brett's forensic reports showed the transfers traced directly to Elise's new business account and, through that, to my parents' joint fund. Each fact landed softly but cleanly, like snow that refuses to melt. Elise tried to interrupt once, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Lillian didn't even look up. "Please refer to Exhibit E," she said, and the monitor lit with Elise's own text messages discussing how to make the switch before Mara notices. The judge's pen stopped moving. I said nothing the entire time. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was armor. When the ruling came, it was short, full restitution, frozen accounts, referral for criminal review. The sound of the gavel was smaller than I expected, more like a closing door than a victory. Outside, the air had turned sharp with wind. Elise stormed past without looking at me. My parents lingered near the steps, their eyes wet and frightened. My mother started to speak, voice trembling. "Mara, we never meant." I stopped her gently. "You taught me to save." I said, "I did." Then I walked down the steps, the sound of my own heels echoing against the stone. Steady and final. Spring came slow to Milwaukee that year, the kind that pretends to be winter until the last possible moment. By the time the settlement cleared, the snow had melted into thin gray rivers along the sidewalks, and the city smelled faintly of thawed earth and coffee grounds. The transfer notice arrived in a plain envelope, no ceremony, no apology. Numbers moved from one account to another, neat as math. I didn't feel triumph, just completion. A balance sheet closing. I sold the remaining shares of Ellison Group, not out of spite, but because the name no longer belonged to me. With part of the proceeds, I bought a narrow brick building downtown, a place with creaking floors and big windows that caught the afternoon light, on the ground level. I opened a small classroom under a sign that read, "Compound interest and second chances." Twice a week, a dozen people showed up, single parents, retirees, a few teenagers curious about saving. I taught them what my grandfather had taught me: how time multiplies what you protect, how quiet effort grows when no one is watching. I used real examples, not theory. Sometimes, during a break, someone would ask why I started the program. I'd just smile and say, because someone once believed in patience more than luck. I furnished the room simply a chalkboard, second-hand chairs, a small coffee station. On the back wall hung one framed photo, my grandfather in his factory uniform, sleeves rolled up, a half smile under a smear of grease. The corner of the print still showed the date 1960, everything else awards, plaques. Even the portrait from my old office I gave away. They belonged to a version of me who thought proof was necessary. Now I measured value differently in quiet mornings, in full classes, in knowing that what endures doesn't need an audience. Winter returned early, laying a thin sheet of snow across the Milwaukee River like a white breath. The city glowed softly under the streetlights, quiet, unhurried, the way I'd learned to be. I walked along the riverfront in my old wool coat, the same one I'd worn the day everything fell apart, though now it felt lighter somehow. The glass windows of the Chase branch reflected my silhouette as I passed. For a moment, I saw the woman I used to be, tense shoulders, uncertain eyes, always measuring worth by what could be lost. Then the reflection shifted. The woman looking back was older, steadier, unmistakably her own, inside the bank. People moved through the evening routine, counting drawers, locking cabinets, wiping counters. I watched them for a moment and thought of my grandfather's letter, still folded neatly in my desk at home. The ink had faded, but the words had outlasted everything else. I whispered them to the snow, the way I used to whisper prayers when I didn't believe in answers. Time makes money grow, but it makes character visible. The words warmed the air in front of me. They weren't about wealth anymore. They were about endurance, the quiet kind that doesn't need proof. A few blocks away, the lights in my classroom were already on. Through the window, I could see the first students arriving, shaking snow from their coats, holding notebooks and styrofoam cups of coffee. I crossed the street slowly, careful not to slip, and smiled at the sight. It was the same city, the same river, the same winter, but the timing was finally mine. I opened the door. The bell chimed softly, and I stepped into the warmth to begin again.